Hello everyone, I hope you had a good week. Today I'm going to talk about the next set of poems from Eikyū Hyakushu, which are on the topic of kokage, which I've translated here as shade beneath the trees. Although the shadow of the trees' shade, the trees' shadows, all of those could be potentially translations for this particular phrase. Now, anyone who's been out in the heat of summer will be well aware of the feeling of walking along in the hot sun and getting that blessed sense of relief when you step into some shade and get some coolness and some respite from the sun beating down on you. So it's really not surprising that the poets of old Japan picked this as a standard topic for summer-themed poems, particularly if you imagine that in Japan in the summer the temperature can get up into the low 30s, and it really does feel like a hammer hitting on the top of your head if you're walking around in it, and it's just wonderful to step into a bit of shade and get some temporary coolness. So that's the general sense that these poems all convey, of that sense of relief from the heat of summer. These particular poems in Eikyū Hundred are free of some of the heavier and more obvious allusions which the poets have been making in some of the more recent groups of poems we've been talking about. But nevertheless, there are still some hints of double meanings and some clever techniques used, and I'll point these out and talk a little bit about them as we get to these various poems. So, with no further ado, let's get on with it. Oopsie. Right. Michinobe no この下水を結びつつ、夕影待つぞ、久しかりける. At the roadside, beneath the trees, the water cupping in my hand, I await the evening shade. It takes so long to come. This is, of course, a relatively simple poem describing a traveller's. You can tell that the speaker of the poem has been travelling by the reference to roadside Michinobe, who has been walking or possibly riding his horse, although that's not mentioned, along in the heat of summer and finally had enough. So he stops for a rest at a place where there's a spring, goes into the cool of the forest, cups water in his hands to splash on his face and to drink, and decides to wait there for the fall of evening. Now, Japan, by virtue of its longitude, is a country which doesn't have long light evenings in summer. It gets dark there just as early as it does in the rest of the year, which is between 5:30 and 6 o'clock in the evening, about. So he's sitting there waiting for that time when the sun goes down, when it gets dimmer, and it naturally becomes a little cooler. And as with anything which is anticipated eagerly, time just seems to drag. So the time is dragging as he's there waiting for evening to fall. 夏の日も安の河原の柳陰。吹きこそ風はしたぞ涼しき。The summer sun, too, upon the river banks in heaven casts the willow shade, blowing across the breeze beneath is cool indeed. Now, Nakazane, in his poem here, actually references a specific river, Yasunokawa, which is a mythical river flowing through Takamagahara, which is the domain of the Shinto deities, the gods of Japan. And there are a number of different myths and stories in older texts about the deities gathering on the banks of this particular river for festivals, other events, and to conduct various rituals. But Nakazane then is drawing this link between this sacred, mythical, magical river up in heaven, in the place where the deities dwell, and what it's like here on earth. So here, even in heaven, it gets hot in summer. Even in heaven, the deities must be wandering around looking for some respite from the heat. And where do they find it? Sitting under a willow tree by the banks of the river, listening to the sound of the river flowing past and seeing the willow's tendrils drift across the surface of the waters. 秋もまだ立ちこぬ先に衣での森の下にはほのめきにけり. When autumn has not yet arisen, just then my sleeves beneath the forest roof have grown dim. Now, this is actually quite a clever poem, I think, by Toshiyori, in that he avoids some of the more standard vocabulary. He doesn't mention coolness explicitly, and he doesn't actually mention shadows at all, simply saying, Honomeki ni keri, it's grown dim. So he evokes coolness through the reference to autumn. Autumn, of course, is the season which is conventionally cool. So you get that sense from that very first line. So it's not yet autumn, but it's got cooler. Why has it got cooler? Well, because I've stepped beneath the cover of the trees. What's happened to me? Well, I've been out in the hot sun, in the bright sun indeed as well. And as naturally happens when you step into the shade from being in a bright place, everything suddenly seems dark. Suzushisha no oiso no mori no shita naredo natsu chō kotozo wasurare rikeru. Cool it is in Oiso's sacred forest grounds. I am beneath the boughs, yet that today is summer I have quite forgotten. Now, Tadafusa adds a little bit to his poem here by referencing a location, Oiso no Mori, which I've translated here as Oiso's sacred forest grounds. This is a reference to the grounds of a shrine, which was located, in fact still is located, in Omi on the banks of Lake Biwa. Now, a reference to Oiso no Mori in a poem generally carried additional sort of senses with it, as a result of the name of the actual location, Oiso. Now, no one quite knows what the origin of the place name is. It could be that there were Oiso, great big rocks nearby, and that's where it came from. Or that maybe it was a place where a monk was Oiso me, first pursued after he stole a sacred sword. But the main meanings in poetry come from the fact that the Chinese character, the kanji, which is used to write the name of the location, oi, which is read oi, was the same kanji which was used to write the word for old age. So very often using this in a poem suggests a sense of old age creeping up on one. There isn't much of this sense in the poem that Tadafusa has written here, unless perhaps it's in that final line, wasurare ni keru, I have quite forgotten. So of course, when you get old, you tend to forget things. But it's only a sort of a slight hint of an evocation here, I think. Natsukawa no kishi no yanagi no ha o shigemi, nami mo ko kage ni yoru nizo arikeru. By a river in summer, upon the bank the willow's leaves grow lush. The waves too the branches' shade do seek. Now here, Kanemasa is returning to that image of the willow tree, and the willow tree by the river, and saying, it's so hot that even the ripples on the water seem to be wanting to come and go into the places on the river where the tree is casting its shade. Omou dochi konomo kanomo ni murei tsutsu, natsu wa ko kagezo tachiu karikeru. A friendly crowd here and there flocking all together. In summer the tree's shadows arise and fall all around. Here Higo, using that image of a friendly crowd of people bustling about and moving around, associates that with the flickering patterns of tree shadows, the leaves of the tree shadows that are cast inside a forest as you're waiting and seeing them moving all around. Azusa yumi mada yuku sue wa haru keki ni, kyou mo kokage ni hi o kurashitsutsu. A catalpa bow, the future lies yet far away. Today, too, within the tree's shade shall I spend the entire day. Now, Daishin chooses here to begin her poem with another makura kotoba, a poetically significant phrase, Azusa yumi, a catalpa bow. This is a sort of a standard epithetic expression which is used in any number of poems to modify things which come after it. Now, Azuse Yumi, the bows of Catalpa, first became significant as a result of a Shinto myth, in that a mystical bird was supposed to have perched on the end of the Catalpa bow, which was owned by the Emperor Jimmu, one of Japan's very first emperors, who was descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. And this magically gave it the power to repel evil spirits, and this was a function which it was believed all bows had. So if you read classical Japanese novels or texts, if anyone thinks that there are demons or spirits about, they call for their servants to twang bowstrings in order to drive them away. But in poetry, the reference to the Azuse Yumi was mainly to convey a sense of length, and so it was used to modify anything which could be believed to give a sense of length or distance. There's a set series of words which I won't go into, which was used for. But in this case, it's sue, which is here as part of yukusue, the future, but sue itself means top or tip. So bow, tip, you get that sense of how it's linked together. So again, it's to add there at the beginning of Daishin's poem a sense of the future stretching out into the far, far future. And how she's arrived there, is looking on it. It's going to be a long, hot day. How's she going to do it? She's going to spend it beneath the shade of the trees and enjoy herself. So there we go. I hope you've found this short talk useful, and I look forward to talking to you next week.